This day is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Do you ever find yourself playing the budgeting game? Well, with the Name Your Price tool from Progressive, you can find options that fit your budget and potentially lower your bills. Try it at Progressive.com. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and affiliates. Price and coverage match limited by state law. Not available in all states. Hello and welcome to This Day, a history podcast from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avirgan. This day, April 4th, 1918, a German immigrant, Robert Prager, was lynched in Collinsville, Illinois, amid anti-German sentiment during World War I. We'll get into the specifics of the anti-German fervor at that time and the German community in this part of the country as well. But just for context, I want to read a quote from President Woodrow Wilson as the U.S. is entering the war. President Wilson says, quote, "Any man who carries a hyphen about with him," meaning something like German American, "any man who carries that hyphen carries a dagger that he is ready to plunge into the vitals of this republic when he gets ready." So maybe it's no surprise then that this level of violent backlash took place. So here to discuss the lynching of Robert Prager are, as always, Nicole Hemmer of Vanderbilt and Kellie Carter-Jackson of Wellesley. Hello there.
Hello, Jody.
Hey there.
Let's paint the picture of the community in which Prager arrives as an immigrant and then eventually meets his fate.
So Prager lives in Collinsville, Illinois, and this is a town that's just across the river from St. Louis. It has about 10,000 people in 1918, and it is part of this Ohio River Valley where hundreds of thousands of German immigrants settled in the 19th century. My family settled in this area, places like Cincinnati, Evansville, where I'm from. My grandparents grew up in a town called Darmstadt, and all of the roads had German names. People spoke German. There were German newspapers. And Collinsville was like this. It was a coal mining town that was part of this broader German American community. German Americans are now the largest kind of ethnic subgroup in the United States. At the time, there were roughly 8 million German Americans in the United States. There were hundreds of German language newspapers, German language schools. I think 25%, like a quarter of all high school students in the U.S. studied German in 1915. I studied it in high school. I studied it in college because that's what you did. You grew up in a German area, you spoke German. But that is all going to collapse pretty dramatically with the onset of World War I, when the U.S. is gearing up to enter the war, and it becomes clear that the Germans are going to be the enemies of the United States in that effort. You get this real backlash to German culture in the United States. The arguments that are being made at the time is that German culture is inherently warlike and uncivilized and authoritarian. And so you start to get these movements to start renaming all the German streets. You get a big freedom fries movement where people have heard Liberty cabbage for sauerkraut and Liberty sandwiches for hamburgers and Liberty hounds for dachshunds. And there's this real backlash that not only is about trying to attack the German language and German culture, but anyone who's suspected of having German sympathies.
I just got to say, okay, fine, call cabbage Liberty whatever, or call cabbage, sauerkraut Liberty cabbage, or call freedom fries. But if someone walks up to you and is like, "What kind of dog is that?" and you're like, "It's a Liberty hound." I mean, come on. But
lame.
Yeah. But look, to your point, Niki, I think the important thing is this. You mentioned that word suspicion, and I think that is the key thing, and it starts right at the top. I mean, I mentioned that quote from Woodrow Wilson, who basically says we should treat everyone who's a hyphenate as someone who is ready to carry a dagger plunging into the vitals of this republic. The Collinsville Advertiser wrote that unless known by years of association to be absolutely loyal, every German or Austrian in the United States should be treated as a potential spy. You can see how some of this language is resonant, that your first idea is that they are unpatriotic, un-American, and then they have to prove it otherwise. And this has immediate and huge fallout, not just on Robert Prager, who we'll talk about in a second, but there are a number of tarring and featherings and assaults around the country. There's mobs. And you have pressure on all of these groups, churches, alliances, schools, and so forth.
These are difficult times for anyone that is not basically a WASP. You know, it is, when you think of how this is like a decade or a season, an era of lynching and violence against immigrants, against anyone that sort of runs counter or lives counter or speaks counter to this nationalistic American ethic. It's an extremely difficult time period to live in. I was talking, if I'm time traveling, I'm not going back to the early 20th century. No ways. No ways. Well, it is violent.
Can I just add one thing about that? Because, I'm not a historian, but I did my undergraduate thesis on the music of Joe Hill. Joe Hill was a European immigrant in the early couple decades of this century, just in this era right here. And he joined unions and he helped write music for unions. And I think I fell sway to it too. This idea of like, oh, this working class, multicultural, union-driven, progressive era resurgence in this moment. And it's just like, you have to remember, like, no. Even among unions that are fighting for quote unquote rights for all, there is a lot of racism, sexism, xenophobia going on. And, I don't know. That's maybe I'm the only one who kind of has to check myself on that. I just feel like it's worth saying.
I mean, it's called the progressive era. People expect it to be this sort of enlightened period, but this is a period, as you're saying, Jody, of rising nativism. It's going to end with the U.S. basically forbidding non-white people from immigrating to the United States. And what's so interesting about this moment is you see how deep-seated and violent that xenophobia is. Even before Robert Prager, there's a Lutheran minister in this Collinsville area who was run out of town because he refused to renounce his German citizenship. Like, there is this threat that is hanging over German Americans during this period.
All right. What do we need to know about Robert Prager himself?
So when Prager comes onto the scene in the midst of this environment, it's rough. He really can't catch a break. He was born in Dresden. He comes to America at age 17 in 1905, and he can't really find a lot of work. He actually spends a year in prison for theft. He gets out of prison, moves to St. Louis, and is just trying to make opportunities for himself. He's trying to get employed. He even tried to join the Navy, and he gets denied because he had an eye condition. They would do all these health screenings in order to see if you were fit to serve. And apparently he was rejected for being unfit. And so he tried to work for a coal mine, which is also not great work. And he gets rejected from that union. It could have been because he was German. It might have also been because, he just didn't have enough experience. He was young. But again, he just can't seem to catch a break.
But so he shows up eventually in Collinsville, and he's made some enemies, I suppose, amongst the union. Do we have a sense of what the inciting incident is that leads to him getting into trouble?
It could have been him speaking out against the union. The fact that he got rejected from it probably caused him to say, well, this union can kick rocks or whatever. And next thing you know, he's being targeted. To add to the fact that he's German on top of that is something else that I think was motivating in this attack.
Have you noticed anything about your neighborhood church? Maybe it's boarded up, converted to some other use, or just abandoned. I'm Mateo Schimpf, host of The Final Service. It's a new podcast series that answers a really big question in 4 parts. What does a community lose when a church closes its doors for good? And how will the ones that survive manage to keep them open? The Final Service drops April 10th, wherever you listen to podcasts.
Ultimately, though, it's his Germanness that becomes the focus when, one night he's at home and a drunken mob comes to his house and they pull him out of his house. They strip him naked. They put a rope around his neck. They parade him down Main Street and they make him sing patriotic songs, right? So this takes a very dark, xenophobic turn very quickly. And they start to get really sadistic. They break beer bottles and they make him step on the glass. They make him profess his love for America. They present him a flag that he has to kiss and that his tormentors wrap him in. And eventually...
This is public torture. This is public torture.
Yeah. It is public torture. It is done as spectacle, right? Like, this isn't just about Robert Prager. It is a message to other German Americans in the area that they are being watched, and this could be what is waiting for them if they are insufficiently patriotic.
And of course, the police are there after the fact. They say that maybe they tried to intervene. It's unclear. The reports say the police just watched this happen. He eventually does get taken and moved to the jail, basically for his own safety, but then gets sort of broken back out. There are accusations that he's a spy. He's being marched towards a tree where he is going to be hung. And at one point he says to the group that is going to lynch him, he says, all right, boys, go ahead and kill me, but wrap me in the flag when you bury me, which is just remarkable. Kellie, do you want to, we were talking before we recorded about the kind of lynching as spectacle, the idea that there were, I don't know if you would call them like hanging trees in the center of town, but I mean, the fact that like this was a sort of public event.
Lynchings were spectacles that could be announced in the paper. It could be, we're doing a lynching today at 3 p.m. Show up. These were gatherings in which people brought their families. They brought their children to watch. They used the photography from these images as postcards and sent them all over the country. Hey, here's the barbecue we had last night. And it's a picture of, a lynching or a person like burned at the stake. I mean, the spectacle in this kind of knows no bounds. I mean, it wasn't just the lynching. People would be mutilated. Their body parts would be stripped and displayed in window shop cases. Like Du Bois talks about walking through Atlanta and seeing a black person's knuckles in a window shop. I mean, like, these were grotesque moments, but they were moments that the public participated in, like wholesale participated in. And, I was just talking to my class today about showing an image, and the image was not of the lynching itself. It was of the crowd, and how there's a little girl in the crowd who is not covering her eyes, not hiding behind her father. She is standing and looking straight at this mutilated body, and there's a smirk on her face. And people are being, programmed or inculcated to take part in these things and find pleasure in the death of these people. And it's just unimaginable because oftentimes, as you'll find with Prager, no one is held accountable.
Yeah.
No one is held accountable for this because there's so much corporate participation.
Does it matter to you that in this case we have a white person, a German immigrant, and most of the lynchings that we think of in this era are of black people?
It's not particularly shocking. I mean, we've talked also about the lynching of a Jewish man. We've talked about the lynching of a Chinese man in Los Angeles. So lynchings weren't specifically for black people, although majority black people are being lynched. But the lynch mob is really for anyone that runs counter to the values of society, or anyone that feels like a threat or a danger to the society. And because they feel like a danger and a threat, it legitimizes that death and that murder.
Yeah.
I think that legitimacy part is so important because we think about lynch mobs now, and maybe now we understand them a little better, but we think about lynch mobs now and it's hard to understand how they were so acceptable. But there is this idea that it is a legitimate part of upholding the social order. The Washington Post runs an editorial. The Washington Post, right? Like a national newspaper very far away from Collinsville, Illinois. And the editorial basically says, yes, there are these excesses such as lynching, but it is, as they said, it is a healthful and wholesome awakening in the interior part of the country. Enemy propaganda must be stopped, even if a few lynchings may occur. So, it's called an excess, but it's also like, well, that's, it's the means to an end, and we are okay with the means.
Yeah, right. And so as this moves into the trial, 11 men are put on trial for the lynching, and that is basically the defense. We believe this man was disloyal. We believe he was possibly a spy. There were claims that, we thought he was going to maybe blow up the mine. But again, trying to couch it in this legitimate exercise of justice in a way. The local newspaper continues to refer to Prager as an enemy alien on their pages. I mean, the town is very much still in their xenophobic fervor. The jury deliberates for less than an hour and acquits all 11 men. Afterwards, they pose for a group photo holding miniature flags outside the courthouse. Prager, we said that request of his to be wrapped in the flag when he's killed, he is buried wrapped in an American flag. There was some...
You wouldn't wrap me in no flag. I'm sorry. That just, to me, there's no way I go down with patriotism in my heart. There's no way. But that, to me, I mean, and maybe even in his last breath, he was trying to prove that he was not who they said he was. Mm-hmm. But the whole... It's just gross. Yeah.
There were some people who spoke out against it. You know, Illinois Senator Lawrence Sherman talked about the Sodom and Gomorrah of Illinois and talked about this being a drunken mob. The Wilson administration was mostly worried that word of this would get out to the Germans and it would lead them to treat American, maybe POWs, poorly. But, you know, I think largely speaking, we've talked about the kind of way the mob and the anti-German sentiment was whipped up in this moment. I think people largely saw this as justice.
Yeah. And there continues to be attacks on Germanness in the United States after this. You know, churches get together, and if they have the word German in their name, they move to take it out. Public schools in the area take German instruction out of their schools. I know my grandma had been speaking German at home, and they stop speaking German in public because it's too dangerous to do it. And it is a way of signaling your loyalty to speak in English instead of German. And it's just that moment that German culture becomes something dangerous in the United States.
Fascinating. And of course, this continues as the war goes on and doesn't really go away for a long, long while. All right. Well, we're going to leave it there. This is another one a number of listeners have suggested we get to, so I'm glad we did. But Nicole Hemmer, thanks to you as always.
Thank you, Jody.
And Kellie Carter-Jackson, thanks to you.
My pleasure.
Radiotopia.